Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode number 16 of History for Shut-ins. Today, we are going to put a bow on the presidency of James Madison by talking about his top foreign policy issue, which is the War of 1812. Before I move on, I want to clean up a little mess that I created when talking about the Louisiana Purchase. I was confusing Madison, who was the Secretary of State to Jefferson at the time, and with James Monroe, who was an envoy that Madison sent to France to negotiate the sale of the Louisiana Territory, as well as Robert Livingston, who was the U.S. Minister to France at the time. So, want to clean that up. Now we can move along to the War of 1812, which many times is a forgotten war. Folks tend to remember, of course, the Revolutionary War and then jump right to the Civil Wars, the next battle next war, I should say, that the United States was involved in. However, you have both the War of 1812 and then you have the Mexican War about a decade before the Civil War. So today we will talk about the War of 1812. The War of 1812 takes place from June 18th, 1812 through February 17th of 1815. It was, of course, the United States against Great Britain. So less than, 30 years, if you will, after, or 40 years. I was a history major, not a math major. Less than 40 years after the War for Independence had begun. The British and the Americans are going at it again, this time over British violations of American maritime rights. The war ends with the negotiation of the Treaty of Ghent. Tensions came from both the French Revolutionary War, which was 1792 to 1799, and the Napoleonic Wars, which are 1799 to 1815. Remember, Napoleon takes power basically as an emperor during the end of the French Revolution and then tries to make much of Europe France through conquest. During these conflicts, the French Revolutionary Wars Revolutionary War and the Napoleonic Wars, American interests are hurt by the British, who are still upset over losing to America during the Revolution, as well as French moves to block the United States from trading with the French and vice versa, or from the British and the British trying to keep us from trading with the French. Remember, as part of Washington's farewell address, he had advised against foreign entanglements. And the United States came close. There were great debates during the French Revolution of repaying the French and joining them, helping them. But wisely, the United States did not get involved. Great Britain and France, and to a degree Spain, are still fighting wars for empire. And the United States, very wisely, under the leadership of Washington, Adams, and Jefferson, stay out of those wars because, one, we're in debt. Two, we don't have quite the military strength that is needed to get involved here. So, United States shipping initially prospered. We're going to step back a little bit. It initially prospered from trade with the French and the Spanish. The British countered with a belated enforcement of the Rule of 1756, which basically states that trade not permitted in peacetime is not allowed in wartime. The British Navy enforced this act in 1793 and 1794, particularly in the Caribbean. Think of the West Indies and such. Before signing the Jay Treaty in November of 1794. Under the Jay Treaty, United States maritime commerce was given trading privileges in Great Britain, and and the British East Indies, Great Britain agreed to evacuate forts held in the Northwest Territory by June 1st of 1796. When we talk the Northwest Territory, we're talking Detroit, that area. And the last stipulation of the Jay Treaty was that the Mississippi River was declared freely open to both the Americans and the British. After Jefferson becomes president, relations with the British hit a sour note, and enforcement of the rule of 1756 resumes after 1805. There is a decisive British naval victory at the Battle of Trafalgar in October of 1805, and efforts by the British to blockade French ports prompted Napoleon to cut off Great Britain from European and United States trade. There is a decree called the Berlin Decree, signed November 21st of 1806, which establishes Napoleon's continental system. And what this did, it basically impinged on the neutral rights of the United States by designating ships that visited British ports as enemy vessels. The Brits respond with orders in council on November 11th of 1807, which required that neutral ships obtain licenses at British ports before trading with France or French colonies. France then announces the Milan Decree less than a week later on November 17th, 1807, which expands the Berlin Decree by authorizing the capture of any neutral ships that are trading, any neutral vessel, that had submitted to search by the British. Remember, a big problem at this time is impressment of seamen by the British. And their thought is many of the sailors on U.S. ships are British deserters, which in many cases it's true. But in casting that wide net, they also grab a lot of U.S. citizens. U.S. ships under the Milan Decree that obeyed the British faced capture by the French and vice versa. So you can see the United States is really in the middle here of this fight. As I said, British impressment that to keep its ships fully crewed angered the United States. In 1807, the frigate HMS Leopard fired on a United States Navy frigate, the Chesapeake, and seized 4 sailors. 3 were United States citizens. Jefferson chose to exert economic pressure against both Great Britain and France by pushing Congress in December of 1807 to pass the Embargo Act, which forbade all U.S. export shipping and most imports from Great Britain. The Embargo Act was like taking a sledgehammer when a scalpel would have been more effective. The Embargo Act hurts the United States more than it hurt the British or the French, causing many in the United States to ignore it or defy it. Before Jefferson left office in 1809, Congress sees that the Embargo Act is too expansive, and what they do is they replace it with the Non-Intercourse Act, which exclusively forbade trade with England and France, and that's it. You could trade with anybody else. The Embargo Act said you couldn't trade with anybody. It was ineffective, and it was replaced by Macon's Bill number 2 on May 1st of 1810 that resulted or resumed trade with all nations, but stipulated that if Great Britain or France dropped commercial restrictions, the United States would revive non-intercourse against the other. In August of 1810, Napoleon insinuates that he would exempt U.S. shipping from the Berlin and Milan decrees. Although the British demonstrated that French restrictions continued, Madison reinstates non-intercourse against the British in November of 1810. And this ratchets things up. As we were talking, the War of 1812 starts in June, so we're about 6 months out from war. British refusal to yield on neutral rights derived from more than the European War. British manufacturing and shipping interests demanded that the British Navy promote and sustain British trade against United States competitors. The policy convinced many in the U.S. that they were being consigned to a colonial status. We're our own republic now, right? We're not a British colony. So there are problems there. Great Britain denounces American actions that effectively made the United States a participant in Napoleon's continental system. Events on the U.S. northwestern frontier, again, think Detroit area, and south of that, of course, as well. But on the northwest frontier area, there are events which increase the friction. Native American fears over American encroachment become more conspicuous as tensions between the British and the Americans are ratcheted up. Shawnee tribe brothers Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa, say that 5 times fast, Tenskwatawa, the prophet, easier to say that, attracted followers from the discontent and attempted to form an Indian confederation to counteract the expansion or the moves that the United States was making to expand territory. Although Major General Isaac Brock, who is a British commander of Upper Canada, which is modern-day Ontario, had orders to avoid worsening problems on the frontier with the United States, settlers of the United States blamed the British for increasing tensions with Native Americans in the Northwest Territory. As war loomed, Brock sought to increase his regular as well as Canadian militia forces with Native American allies, which confirmed the fears of American settlers. Brock's efforts were aided in the fall of 1811 when Indiana Territorial Governor William Henry Harrison fought the Battle of Tippecanoe. We're going to talk about William Henry Harrison. He becomes president in 1840. So, William Henry Harrison fights the Battle of Tippecanoe and destroys the Indian settlement at Prophetstown, which is near modern-day Battleground, Indiana. Harrison's action convinces most Native Americans in the Northwest Territory that their only hope of survival is to stick with the British against the United States. U.S. settlers believed that Britain's removal from Canada would end their Native American problems. Canadians suspected that expansionists in the United States were using Native American unrest as an excuse for a war of conquest against Canada. With pressure mounting, Madison calls Congress into session in November of 1811. Western and Southern war hawks were very vocal. They support going to war, especially after Kentucky war hawk Henry Clay, who we will talk about quite a bit moving forward, was elected Speaker of the House of Representatives. Madison sent a war message to Congress on June 1st, 1812, and signed the declaration of war on June 18th, 1812. The vote divided the House about 80 to 50, 79 to 49, and was extremely close in the Senate, 19-13. Seafaring New Englanders opposed the war, while Westerners and Southerners supported it. New Englanders aren't for it because their shipping, their manufacturing is going to take a hit here. Federalists accused war advocates of expansionism under the ruse of promoting U.S. maritime rights. What does the United States do? We attack Canada, but no desire existed to really make Canada part of the United States. The prospect of taking East and West Florida from Spain encouraged Southern support for the war. British commercial restrictions hurt farmers in the U.S. by borrowing their produce from Europe. Remember, at the time, with the open navigation of the Mississippi, goods would flow down the Mississippi to New Orleans and then would go on ships, as one example, would go on ships to Europe. Regions removed from these maritime concerns held a material interest in protecting neutral shipping because their goods are being shipped. So somebody in Iowa might say, hey, I'm not so concerned about U.S. maritime rights, but you know what? I need my corn to get over to Great Britain or France or Spain or wherever it may be going. The onset of war both surprised Great Britain and it almost chagrined them, kind of the way Great Britain still looks at the United States as a little brother. So it's like an older brother almost putting their hand on the head of a younger brother saying, okay, take it easy here. But Great Britain was occupied more with Napoleon than they were with the United States. Political changes in Great Britain moved the government to assume a conciliatory posture toward Prime Minister Spencer Perceval's assassination. So he's killed a month before the United States declares war in 1812. He's killed in May of 1812. Who comes to power? A more moderate Tory government under Lord Liverpool. The British West Indies planters had been complaining for years about interdiction of Great Britain with United States trade. Their growing influence, the West Indies, along with a growing British recession, convinced Great Britain that the orders in council went against their interest. On June 16th, 2 days before the United States declared war, the orders of council were suspended. Some view the timing of this concession as a lost opportunity for peace because, think about it, transatlantic communication in the day is extremely slow. It could take at least a month, maybe more. So news of this potential concession does not reach Washington, D.C. until after war has been declared. Because Great Britain's impressment policy remained and frontier Native American skirmishes continued, repeal of the orders alone would not have prevented war, but it at the very least would have gotten the U.S. and Great Britain talking. Neither the British in Canada or the U.S. were prepared for war. Of course, like any war, there was high optimism in the United States when it started. The British government, with one eye on Napoleon and the European conflict, saw hostilities with the United States as a distraction, resulting in a shortage of resources coming to Canada and the United States. Men, supplies, and naval presence. They aren't available until later in the war. As the British in Canada conducted operations with scant resources, their only consolation was that the United States military was in a malaise. They couldn't get out of their own way. Michigan's territorial governor, William Hull, led U.S. forces into Canada from Detroit, but Isaac Brock, who we talked about earlier, the British commander, and Tecumseh's warriors chased Hull back across the border, pushing him into surrendering Detroit on August 16th, 1812. So less than 2 months after the war has started, Detroit has been surrendered without firing a shot. The United States and Brooks officers found it disgraceful. So the feeling in the U.S. was that Brooks was a coward. His own men felt that. The Northwest territories fell prey to Native American raids and British incursions by Major General Henry Proctor. Hull's replacement is Proctor, or pardon me, Hull's replacement is William Henry Harrison, Harrison could barely defend the few scattered outposts with the few men that he had. On the northeast border, Brigadier General, Henry Dearborn could not attack Montreal because of uncooperative New England militias. United States forces under Stephen Van Rensselaer, for whom the town in New York is named, crossed the Niagara River to attack the British Queenston on October 13th of 1812, but were defeated by a stiff British defense organized by Brock, who was killed. U.S. General Alexander Smith's subsequent invasion attempts on the Niagara were complete fiascos. In 1813, Madison replaces Dearborn with Major Generals James Wilkinson and Wade Hampton. An awkward arrangement made worse by a complicated invasion plan against Montreal. The generals refused to coordinate their efforts, and neither came close to Montreal. To the west, American Oliver Hazard Perry's Lake Erie Squadron won a great victory off Put-in Bay on September 10, 1813, against Captain Robert Barclay. The battle opened the way for Harrison to retake Detroit and defeat Proctor's British and Native American forces at the Battle of the Thames on October 5th. Tecumseh is killed during the battle, shattering his confederation and the Anglo-Indian alliance. Native American anger continued elsewhere, especially in the Southeast. Remember the Florida territories, where the Creek War erupts in 1813 between Creek Indian nativists, known as Red Sticks, and forces of the United States. The war also took an ugly turn late in 1813 when U.S. forces evacuating the Niagara Peninsula razed the Canadian village of Newark, prompting the British commander, Gordon Drummond, to retaliate along the New York frontier, leaving communities like Buffalo in ruins. Early in the war, the small United States Navy boosted sagging American morale as officers such as Isaac Hull, Stephen Decatur, and William Bainbridge commanded heavy frigates in impressive single-ship actions. The British Admiralty responded by instructing captains to avoid individual contests with the Americans, and within a year the Royal Navy had blockaded important American ports, bottling up U.S. frigates. British Admiral George Cockburn also conducted raids on the shores of Chesapeake Bay. In 1814, Great Britain extended its blockade from New England to Georgia, and forces under John Sherbrooke occupied parts of Maine. If there are any questions as we're going through, please stop, type it in, and I'll be happy to answer. By 1814, capable American officers such as Jacob Brown, Winfield Scott, who was the first commander of Union forces in the Civil War, and our buddy Andrew Jackson, who we're going to talk a lot about in upcoming sessions, replaced ineffective veterans from the American Revolution. On March 27, 1814, Jackson defeated the Red Stick Creeks at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in Alabama, ending the Creek War. That spring, after Brown crossed the Niagara River and took Fort Erie, Brigadier General Phineas Riall advanced to challenge the American invasion, but American regulars, commanded by Scott, repulsed him at the Battle of Chippewa on July 5th of 1814. In turn, Brown retreated when Commodore Isaac Chauncey's Lake Ontario squadron failed to rendezvous with the Army, and during this retrograde, the war's costliest engagement occurred at the Battle of Lundy's Lane on July 25th. Riall, who was reinforced by Drummond, fought the Americans to a very bloody stalemate in which each side suffered more than 800 casualties before Brown's army withdrew to Fort Erie. In 1814, Napoleon's defeat allowed sizable British forces to come to the United States. That summer, veterans under Canadian Governor General George Prevost marched south along the shores of Lake Champlain into New York, but they returned to Canada after Thomas MacDonough defeated a British squadron under Captain George Downey at the Battle of Plattsburgh Bay, which is in New York. This is on September 11th, 1814. British raids in Chesapeake Bay, directed by Admiral Alexander Cochrane, were more successful. British General Robert Ross captured Washington, D.C. August 24th and burned government buildings, including the Capitol and the Executive Mansion, which of course is now known as the White House. The British justified this action as retaliation for the American destruction of York, which is modern-day Toronto, the capital of Upper Canada, in the previous year. The British assault on Baltimore, which took place September 12th through 14th, foundered when Americans fended off an attack at North Point and withstood the naval bombardment of Fort McHenry, an action that, of course, inspired Francis Scott Key's The Star-Spangled Banner. Ross was killed at Baltimore, and the British left Chesapeake Bay to plan an offensive against New Orleans. Meanwhile, Federalists in New England, angry about the war's effect on their economy, gathered at Hartford, Connecticut to propose ways of redressing their grievances. From December 15th, 1814 to January 5th, 1815, the Hartford Convention adopted moderate resolutions, but its mere existence prompted other parts of the country to question New England's patriotism and Federalist loyalty, which spelled eventual doom to the Federalist Party. Immediately after the war started, the Tsar of Russia offered to mediate. London refused, but early British efforts for an armistice revealed a willingness to negotiate so that Great Britain could turn its full attention to Napoleon. Talks began at Ghent in modern Belgium in August 1814, but with Napoleon having been defeated, the British stalled while waiting for news of a decisive victory in America. Most Britons were angry at the United States because they thought, and what they saw the United States, they said the U.S. had become an unwitting ally of Napoleon. But even that sentiment was half-hearted among the people who had been at war in Europe for more than 20 years. For more than 20 years. After learning of Plattsburgh and Baltimore, and upon the advice of the Duke of Wellington, the commander of the British Army at the Battle of Waterloo, the British government sued for peace. The United States abandoned demands about ending impressment. The end of the European War meant it was basically over anyway. And the British dropped attempts to change the Canadian boundary and established a Native American barrier state in the Northwest. The commissioners signed a treaty on December 24th, 1814. Based on the status quo, the Treaty of Ghent did not resolve the issues that had caused the war. But at that point, Great Britain was tired of fighting, and the United States government deemed not losing it a substitute that they could tolerate, a substitute for victory. Nevertheless, many Americans became convinced that they had won the contest. Unaware of the treaty, British forces under Edward Pakenham assaulted New Orleans on January 8, 1815, and were soundly defeated by Andrew Jackson's army, an event that contributes to the notion of the United States winning the War of 1812. The unanimous ratification by the U.S. Senate of the Treaty of Ghent and the celebrations that followed disguised the fact that the United States had achieved none of its objectives. Contention in the United States had hobbled the war effort, and domestic disaffection had menaced the Union. But after the war, a surge of patriotism inspired Americans to pursue national goals. Contrary to American expectations, Canada remained British and eventually developed its own national identity, partly from pride over keeping the United States from a successful invasion of Canada. Meanwhile, Great Britain's influence among the Northwestern Native Americans, again, we're talking Detroit area, was basically over. And American expansion in that region proceeds unchecked. In the South, the Creek War opened a large part of the South for settlement and led to the events that persuaded Spain to cede Florida to the United States in 1821. The most enduring international consequence of the war was in the arbitration clauses of the treaty, perhaps the most important feature. Its arrangements to settle outstanding disagreements, establish methods that could adapt to changing United States presidential administrations, changing British ministries, and world events. There lay the seeds of Anglo-American friendship that would weather future disagreements to sustain the longest unfortified border in the world. So, the legacy of Madison. His handling of the War of 1812 is actually compared often to Abraham Lincoln's handling of the Civil War, although Madison doesn't quite take the liberty with executive power that Lincoln does. Madison's government marshaled resources. They faced secessionist threats from New England and proved to Great Britain the folly of fighting further wars with the United States. Madison established respect for United States rights on the high seas and emerged from the war with more support than he had when he was first inaugurated. Madison saw the need for a national bank and supported its establishment. We will talk about the National Bank under John Quincy Adams and really under Andrew Jackson in the coming days. Madison increased government powers during the war and took a firm federal stance in the face of treason and sedition. His executive sense of priorities always considered first and foremost the immediate demands of the crisis and national needs of the moment. Because he was on the winning side of every important issue from 1776 to 1816, Madison is arguably the most successful and influential of all the founding fathers. He gets lost in the sauce a lot with Washington, Jefferson, Adams, Hamilton, on and on and on. But he's got a 40-year run of success. We are going to end today there and pick up tomorrow with the administration of James Monroe and the Monroe Doctrine. Thank you for joining today. Again, if there are any questions whatsoever, please leave them here and I'm happy to answer them before tomorrow's session. Otherwise, I will see you all tomorrow for episode number 17 of History for Shut-ins. Have a good night.